Hello and welcome to ENCA Moneyline, your money guide. My name is Sikim Kabateli. Coming up on the show tonight, yet another South African financial institution is in trouble for alleged reckless lending. South Africa could raise 86 billion rand from selling its assets to help struggling parastatals. And in our You and Your Money segment, we take a look at the benefits of leasing a car. But first, here are your top stories. UK bank Barclays believes South Africa could raise 86 billion rand from selling some government assets. The country needs to raise funds to bail out various parastatals, including embattled power supplier Eskom. The state owns valuable assets, including land, real estate, and shares in listed companies. Barclays says government stake in publicly traded firms like the 14% holding in Vodacom and 40% in Telkom would fly off the shelves. The last major asset sell-off was in 2003 when government sold 25% of telecommunications company Telkom for almost 4 billion rand. Eskom, which is struggling to meet the country's power demands, needs at least 20 billion rand. The South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry has asked businesses to submit proposals on how to survive rolling blackouts. Eskom has reiterated that the national power grid remains under pressure. However, as denied load shedding is on the cards this week, SACCI is worried about the impact of outages on the economy and business confidence. The Chamber has promised to work with Eskom to find solutions to the power crisis. In the meantime, it's appealed to consumers and its members to limit electricity usage wherever possible. Yet another South African financial institution is in trouble for reckless lending. Mine worker-focused Ubank has been referred to the Consumer Tribunal by the National Credit Regulator. The NCR says Ubank should be fined for reckless lending and be forced to change its business practices. The lender has been accused of granting credit to consumers who were already behind on other debt repayments. About 80% of Ubank's loan book is made up of gold and platinum mine workers. This incident comes on the heels of the implosion of African Bank late last year. African Bank is currently under curatorship. For more on the allegations of reckless lending against Ubank, I'm joined on the line now by Lisiba Mashapa, who is with the National Credit Regulator. Lisiba, good evening to you and thanks for your time. How did you become aware of these allegations of reckless lending?
Good evening, Siki, and good evening to the viewers. It was because of the investigation that we conducted on Ubank, and it was a proactive investigation for the NCR to determine whether Ubank is complying with the National Credit Act.
So how do you define reckless lending then in the National Credit Act?
In the National Credit Act is when the credit provider doesn't conduct an affordability assessment. In other words, they don't assess the consumer's ability to repay the loan.
Yeah.
The second instance is when, after conducting that assessment, they would still give the consumer a loan, which makes the consumer to be over-indebted. In other words, after the loan installment is deducted, the consumer no longer has disposable income to meet their monthly expenses.
Okay, and you found that this is what Ubank had been doing with its customers?
The findings from the investigation related to the second aspect of reckless lending, in terms of which the finding was that the credit that was granted to the consumer made them to be over-indebted.
You've now referred this particular case to the Consumer Tribunal. What happens now?
What happens now is, after our application has been filed at the National Consumer Tribunal, Ubank will have an opportunity to respond to that application, and the NCR will reply to their response, and then a hearing date will be set by the tribunal, where cases will then be presented by both sides. And after that, a decision will be taken by the tribunal.
What sort of redress would you like the affected customers to get should Ubank be found guilty of this?
Obviously, on loans that we believe have been granted recklessly, either because the loans that were made over-indebted consumers, or where consumers were given loans despite the fact that they were struggling to repay other loans, we would want those loans to be written off.
Are you invested?
And then if consumers have been listed at the credit bureaus on the basis of defaults arising from those loans, we will also want those credit bureau listings to be removed.
And do you get a sense that lenders in South Africa are taking this particular issue around reckless lending quite seriously and are adhering to the Act?
I think the majority of the formal lenders are doing their best to adhere to the Act, but you still have pockets of lenders who are disregarding the legislation. And then at the same time, we also have consumers who seem to be colluding with some lenders in order to qualify for loans which really they shouldn't be getting. In other words, what you find in some cases is consumers will approach a lender for a loan, then they will understate their living expenses so that they qualify for the loan.
And
I think what is also important is consumers should also know that as the regulator, we want their behavior to change so that they don't apply for credit if they know that they cannot afford to repay it.
So how do we deal with that? Is it more consumer education? I mean, I get the sense that people know when they cannot afford something, and that there's very little that further consumer education would achieve.
I think what should happen in the long term, if the behavior of consumers do not change, is really also to find a way in terms of which we, through legislation, we can have ways to disincentivize them from borrowing recklessly. In other words, if they deliberately misstated their financial position in credit applications, they shouldn't be able to sue lenders for reckless lending. And we have included that aspect in the affordability assessment regulations, in terms of which if they misrepresent their financial position, they will be prevented from suing credit providers for reckless lending.
All right.
But at the same time, we also appeal to lenders not to lend to consumers who are obviously over-indebted based on the information that they obtain from the credit bureaus and information that is disclosed by consumers.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks for your time today. Lisiba Mashapa is with the National Credit Regulator. The World Bank sees a gloomy outlook for global economic growth for the next 2 years. It's revised downwards its earlier growth forecast for 2015 and 2016. Even the record decline in oil prices, which could boost growth, didn't sway its decision.
Economic concerns in Japan and several emerging economies over reliance on the US recovery and deflation fears facing the Eurozone have the World Bank worried.
Deflation means no growth generally. That's what we've seen in the past. It can be, it's a real curse on an economy. And the Eurozone is now in deflation and it's going to be very difficult for them to get out of it. So I think low growth, that's kind of what the market is expecting for the next few years.
The bank predicts the World Bank will only grow by 3% this year instead of the 3.4% it had predicted earlier. It's sticking to its outlook because it predicts that it will take some time for the drop in oil prices to feed into its forecasts.
I think the World Bank have made probably the right decision by cutting global growth forecasts, because a lot of economies could actually be pushed into, maybe default on the back of this issue where oil prices, they're so reliant on their oil revenues. If they're not coming in and they've fallen so sharply and it looks like oil prices are going to remain low for a long time, and that could really be a threat for some very large economies in the world.
The World Bank says strong growth prospects in the United States and Britain separate them from other rich nations. And while oil importing countries in particular are likely to benefit from the low prices, there's still a downside. Europe and Japan are already feeling the effects of a depressed inflation.
After the break, we take a look at the benefits of leasing a car. You're watching ENCA Moneyline, your money guide. Do stay with us.